want all of you to know that this GEOlogue of ours will be recorded and posted on the GEO YouTube page for all to view later if you like. And also, during the question and answer period, we'll be taking questions by means of the raised hand on the website here on the Zoom page. All that said, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce my friend and former colleague in the Congress, the Honorable Bob Inglis of South Carolina. He and I overlapped for one term back in the 1990s, when it was still not all that unusual for people in different parties actually to know each other, even to speak with each other, even to work with each other on a bipartisan basis on quite a few issues. He and I are both hoping that time will return sometime soon. After I decided to leave the Congress, Bob stayed on for a while. He represented the 4th District in South Carolina from 1993 to 1999, and again from 2005 to 2011. For those of you who don't know, I happen to be a Democrat and Bob happens to be a Republican. And yet he was a very independent thinker in the House, just as I tried my best to be, which is one reason I admire him greatly. And one of his independent thoughts as a Republican member of the House was that climate change is real, we're causing it, and we need to do something about it. He expressed this view, 12 or 14 years ago, after kicking a lot of the climate tires all over the world. And it wasn't any more popular then in the political provinces from which he came than it is now in some of those same provinces. But he didn't just make that statement then. He's continued to make it in devoting his post-political life to working on issues relating to clean energy and the effective addressing of climate change. Bob was a resident fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government in 2011. He was a resident fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics in 2014. Like me, he's a bit of an academic, to the surprise of someone who may see only that former congressional line on his resume. And importantly, he won a very, very major and prestigious award in 2015. He won the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award for his political courage in supporting action on climate change. He's now the executive director of what you see behind him is republican.org, spelled E-N, and referring to energy. And I am very pleased to have him with us here for GEOlogue. And with all that said, I turn to him now. I've told Bob to speak for 25 or 30 minutes if he likes, and then we'll open up for questions. It will be possible to view this recording later on YouTube, as we said, but for those of you who are with us now, you can, as I also said, raise your hand later to pose a question, and then my friend Alex will help me in trying to help Bob get a chance to answer those questions. Congressman Inglis, please go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you, Jim. It's good to be with you. It's nice for you to say all those things because you knew me in Inglis 1.0. There was an Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version, which I will explain. So Uh,
1.0 wasn't all that bad, Bob.
well, I don't know. It's you look in the rearview mirror and you see things that you think, oh golly, I wish I hadn't done that, or
Well,
gee, I could have done that better.
2.0 was really pretty good. I was watching a lot of 2.0 when I was in Geneva at the WTO. That was pretty good.
Yeah, see, that's it. So thank you for focusing mostly on 2.0. Anyway, so it's like this. I should explain, I think at the start, I want to talk about a conservative solution to climate change and get your thoughts, because um, if especially if you're in Florida, and I realize some of you might not be, but some for all you Floridians, we really need your help in figuring out how this could work for conservatives. And I think there's a way. But before that, I think I should maybe give you an idea about how I came to this, because it is odd, right? I mean, what in the deal? Here's a conservative talking about climate change. Doesn't compute, right? I mean, you're not supposed to do that. It's supposed to be a liberal thing. So it's like this. How did this fella get into the climate activism? So for my first 6 years, the years that I was overlapping with Jim, I said that climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And in as much as I represented perhaps the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation, that's Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, that was the end of the inquiry for me. Okay, so I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was for those first 6 years in Congress. And by the way, to substantiate that the district is that conservative, this, it's one of the, at the time, is one of the 6 congressional districts in South Carolina. Now we've got 7. So it's Greenville, Spartanburg. That's a really conservative area, okay? And so I fit the district well for those 6 years. Then I was out of Congress for 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, and had the opportunity to run for the very same seat again in 2004. And so that was a year that my son came to me. He was voting for the first time. He just turned 18, the eldest of our 5 kids. And he said to me, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." So that was his 4 sisters were in agreement. His mother, my wife, was in agreement. New constituency was born. These people can change the locks on the doors to your house. You need to respond to that constituency. So that was a first step of a 3-step metamorphosis. And by the way, my son was going to vote for me no matter what, right? I mean, it wasn't in his economic interest to vote against me. You can lose by 1 vote. And Robert knew that we were mortgaging the farmette that we live on, literally, in order to run for Congress again. So he was going to vote for me no matter what. I think what he's really saying was, "Dad, I love you, and you can be better than you were before. So how about make this English 2.0, the new and improved version, and be relevant to my future and to your 4 daughters' futures?" So that was step 1. Step 2 was going to Antarctic with the science committee, seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. We can go into that if you're interested in what that evidence was. And step 3 was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems improbable, doesn't it, on a godless science committee trip? I mean, we all know that all scientists are godless, right? I mean, well, apparently not, because this Aussie climate scientist who I was snorkeling with at the Great Barrier Reef was showing me the glories of the Great Barrier Reef. And I could tell that he and I shared a worldview. We'd go down, he's got real lung capacity and could stay down. I'd come up gasping, and he'd come back to the surface and tell me what he'd just been showing me. But in his eyes, written all over his face, it was clear that it was all an act of worship for him, that he was not worshiping the corals. He's worshiping the creator of those corals. So I could see it. I knew it. And so, because, St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. And so Scott was preaching the gospel. He's now become a very dear friend. And so later, with the snorkels out of our mouths, we had an opportunity to talk. And he told me about conservation changes that he was making in his life in order to love God and love people. People who would come after us. Scott rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning as much as possible in Townsville, Australia, a pretty hot place. Hangs the family's clothes out on the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. So I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Note to self, do not introduce carbon tax in midst of Great Recession when you represent perhaps the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation. It will not go well. And it did not go well at all. After 12 years in Congress, in a Republican runoff, I got 29% of the vote, and the other guy got the other 71% of the vote. A rather spectacular faceplant. And so at that point, a foundation came to me and said, Inglis, you're a pretty unusual zoo animal. An actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, 0 with the Americans for Democratic Action, 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO. I was really gunning for a 0. I don't know how I got a 23. And so they said, you're an actual conservative who cares about climate. Will you speak and write for the proposition? That's what I've been doing ever since. So now it's this thing called republicen.org. It's 6 of us facilitating a community of about 10,000. We need a 0 or 2 on the end of that number. Probably necessitates a 0 on the end of our budget in order to get there. But also you can join us right here and now. If you go to republicen.org, it'll take you about 45 seconds. Any page you go to, the join button will follow you. And all we need is your email, your name and zip code. Your zip code, because we want to make you visible. If you're a conservative who cares about climate change, we want to make you visible to members of Congress who need to know that you exist. And so that's how I got into this. And now let me place myself in the broader context of climate action politically. And it's like this, it's sort of hard to remember this, right? That it wasn't always this way, where we've been for a while with conservatives opposed to climate action. I mean, it's sort of, you got to force these thoughts back into your head that, let's see, George H.W. Bush, remember, says that those who who misunderstood the White House effect on the climate effect or something. And in that very George H.W. Bush way, he said it, and so he was on board. Early 2008, Newt Gingrich was on board. Do you remember the ad? Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi on a couch. Google Gingrich, Pelosi, and couch, you'll find it. We don't agree on much, do we, Newt? No, Nancy, but we agree climate change is real and we need to do something about it. That was early 2008. By the end of 2008, Newt had switched. We don't know, he said. What happened? Well, 2 things. One, October of 2008, the wheels came off the financial system. The global financial crisis was underway. The Great Recession was starting. And then in November, a secret Muslim, non-American socialist was elected to the White House. He's none of those things, but sadly, those are the names that my party called Barack Obama. I mean, it's okay to disagree with the guy, but you don't need to call him names. And so there began what we at republicen.org call the decade of disastrous disputation. But here's the good news. If it's a decade, I must be postulating that it ended. Well, it did. It ended in 2018 when my party lost control of the US House in suburban districts. And it has now fully dawned on my friend Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader of the House, that he will never be Speaker if he can't win back those suburban districts. And you can't win suburban districts with a retro position on climate change. And so it's turning around in a way, in the early days of me stepping out in this work that Jim was describing to you, I was sort of the worst commercial for it. I mean, like, Inglis, don't let your shadow fall on me. In fact, some people use my name as a verb. You don't want to be Inglised, which meant that you didn't want to be cut off from your Republican base by committing the heresy of saying climate change is real. Well, that's all changed, really. I mean, the circumstances are quite different now, with one caveat, which is the radioactive half-life of MAGA. With that exception, things have changed. So it's no longer, like it was in 2010 when I was getting tossed out. Now, if you're a Republican in Florida, for example, and you're maybe a former member of Congress and you're the governor of that state, you're proposing $1 billion in money from this stimulus package to be used for climate, for resilience, and $1 billion be used for a special emergency fund. Whoa, if you told me that back in 2010, ain't no way that happened. But this is 2021, and the circumstances are different. You have a Floridian that's glowing with that radioactive half-life down there of MAGA that's sort of repelling some of this. But the rest of the party that has a longer term perspective is trying to figure a way forward. And so as to what it means to have a conservative solution for climate change, which I guess is what we've advertised this to be, is what is a conservative solution to climate change. We understand that I've now told you my personal story and how I fit into the broader picture of Republican rejection of climate and how that's ending now. Let me now just, third thing is talk about the what could be that conservative solution and how could it fit, especially with the Biden administration. And we say, if you go to our website, you'll see this expressed fairly succinctly, that there are three ways to deal with climate change. You can regulate it, you can incentivize it, or you can price it. The regulatory approach is something that doesn't come naturally to us because we're conservatives. But even if it did, even if we did share a progressive's confidence in the ability of the EPA to regulate and to accomplish good things, we'd be aware, and I hope that many progressives are aware of the limitation of a regulatory response, in that it doesn't get China and India in on the deal. We can't regulate China and India. We can try to set a moral example. How's that working out for us on human rights? It's sort of, that's the limitation of the regulatory approach. The second approach is to incentivize it. That's to do direct expenditures like charging stations for electric vehicles, and indirect or tax expenditures like tax credits for wind and solar and various other technologies, storage. And if I were still in Congress, I'd probably be voting for some of those things because, if it's what you can do today, do it. But here again, it's got the same probable limitation as the regulatory approach, which is, yeah, you can build charging stations here. You're probably not going to get the American people to sit still for you building them, say, in Europe or China. They're not going to pay for that. And you're probably also not going to get you can't use those the indirect expenditures, the tax expenditures, to incentivize Chinese companies because they don't pay American taxes. So you can't get them in on the deal. And so what you have to hope for in this middle position of incentivizing is that somehow the cost of these products, because of early adoption in America due to those tax incentives, is going to bring the cost down such it's going to be afforded by the rest of the world. Well, that was true in the case of cell phones because of the mass market of 7 billion people who would like to have a cell phone in their pocket. But if you think about it, power production, for example, probably has only what, 10, 20,000 firms that make electricity for customers and send it down the line. So you're talking about a relatively limited market. So anybody innovating in that space has relatively few customers. And that means that the price usually hangs up there. It doesn't come crashing down. And so again, as with regulation, the limitation in the incentivizing approach is you might end up cleaning up local air, which is a good in and of itself and where we should all be for, but you're not solving for climate change because climate change is a worldwide problem. Emissions anywhere are climate change everywhere. So you get to get the whole world in on it. And that leads you to the third, and the rule of threes, of course, I'm going to go with that one, is that pricing it is the thing that we think is so essential. And through a carbon tax that I was just describing, we think it has to have two things. One that Jim is far better to speak to than I am, which is the border adjustment possibility. And really, I do look forward, Jim, to learning from you about more about that, because we believe, based on counsel that we've received, that if it's a content tax, we can apply the tax at our borders based on American equivalent products and collect a content tax and get that through the WTO. We think if we're right about that, China follows our lead, because why would they otherwise pay a carbon tax on entry to the United States when they could have collected it at home and then had that money remitted to Beijing rather than remitting it to Washington on landing in an American port? But that's I think, better discussed by Jim. The other part that we're big on is revenue neutrality, which is that we believe that conservatives would be more attracted to a revenue neutral carbon tax. In other words, you put on the tax, but you pair it with a reduction in taxes somewhere else, or a dividend of all the money from the carbon tax back to the citizenry. Both can be used to address the regressivity of a naked carbon tax, particularly if you reduce the FICA tax, the payroll tax, 12.4%, 6.2% employee, 6.2% employer. It's a whopping regressive tax, really, on poor people. If you reduce that tax and put on the carbon tax, the Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans do better. The only people who do worse are people at the high end who otherwise enjoy a cap on the FICA tax based on maxing out at 140 or so this year. And because those people at the top have heated pools and multiple houses and large houses and fly on corporate jets. And so they continue to pay a lot, but the bottom 70% do better in that tax swap. So we think that can be presented to conservatives in a way that sort of uses that first one, regulatory, as do you want that? If you don't want that, you better come up with something else. And the something else is the pricing mechanism, we believe. And as promised at the outset, then I'm going to go to your questions and comments. I think there's a way to make this work in the Biden administration. Joe Biden mentioned carbon taxes. Helpfully, I get the signals. I get some signals from highly placed people there that he isn't interested in doing climate through reconciliation. He'd rather do it through regular order. If that's true, and he really is interested in reaching out to Republicans, I think that a carbon tax is probably the best way to do that. But it takes what it takes, though, is the half-life of that MAGA thing deteriorating, and it takes some further organizing and development of a constituency on the right that basically can say, Dr. Friedman, if he were still alive, would tell us to do this. You know, there's a great clip you'll see on our website that of Milton Friedman on the Phil Donahue show. And I'm looking to see if people would know how, okay, Alexandra won't know who Phil Donahue was. Let me explain. He was basically a white guy doing an Oprah show. Okay, in the 80s. And so Dr. Milton Friedman used to go on the show with him and they'd spar. And so in this 2-minute clip we got on our website, Donahue asks Friedman, what do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it? Friedman says, you tax it. You tax pollution. And then he goes on to explain the concept of internalizing negative externalities. Jim told me that I could just use that term here and not have to unpack it, which is great, because one time I used the term with the Greenville News, the largest newspaper in the district that I represented. The reporter stopped me and said, what did you say? And I said, we need to internalize the negative externalities. He said, I can't write that in this paper, man. We write at the 7th grade level. I said, reveal the hidden cost. Next day of the paper, it says, Inglis says we need to reveal the hidden costs in the burning of fossil fuels. That's basically it, don't you think? I mean, we basically got the point across. But you know, and I think I frustrate some audiences when I unpack the idea of internalizing negative externalities, because they're thinking, gee, we already know without that, Inglis. And that's really all we talk about at republican.org. And the people in Washington who give me the most hope are the people who really get that. 2 senators in particular, Mike Braun of Indiana and Mitt Romney of Utah. Both are Harvard MBAs. And they fully understand this concept. And they're better at it than me. I talk about it. They've actually done it. Mike Braun in turning around a family business, Mitt Romney, obviously, and being quite successful in figuring out how to use the power of free enterprise. And so the question is whether we can build a constituency for them such that they feel supported in that. And that is so I admit to now, that is the question of the hour. We are right there at that spot where there are people like Mitt Romney and Mike Braun who want to lead on this. They're not willing to commit political suicide, however, I don't think. And so we've got to build a constituency for them. And that's what we're about at republican.org. So you can tell by our name that we present ourselves as fairly partisan, but just in order to get inside our community and to identify so that they can start hearing it in their own language. Because most of the climate conversation has been conducted in the language of the left, which is a communitarian, egalitarian language. It lacks the hierarchical individualism language of the right. And so we add that language, we speak that language, it's our natural language. And that's, we think, opens people up to being able to hear it differently. And then they can say, you know, I just didn't like the solution before, but now you're talking to me about something about free enterprise, I could be for that. And so meanwhile, the thing that's helping us tragically is we're all experiencing climate change. The water is coming up. Things are happening. We're experiencing it. And that's a terrible way to find out the need, but it's upon us. And so, so things have changed, in other words, and we're optimistic about making the most of this moment of Republican rethink and turning it into a constituency for action. So let me stop there and see what questions you have or comments. I'm interested in your comments and suggestions, particularly to say Floridians, we're particularly focused on Florida because we think there's some dynamics there that could really help drive this narrative. Let me, your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Bob. Everyone can see pretty clearly why I admire Bob Inglis. As you probably figured out, we served together on the science committee. And, he was a great supporter of all we try to do in the aerospace community in Central Florida. and we all care about that. I will note that NASA has had to shore up the launch pads there that are so close to the beach because of the rising of the tide. Despite Bob's request, I'm going to defer any comments I may have on carbon border adjustments and their consistency with Article 2.2 paren A of the GATT until perhaps later, and give all of you a chance instead to ask your questions. One of them, of course, does directly to this. Everyone start raising your hands so Alice can remind me. But from Luis Gonzalez, we have this question that does relate to border adjustments. How does the carbon tax put pressure on countries such as India and China to work also on reducing their emissions? Do we tariff imported products based on their carbon footprint?
Yeah, well, yes. So I think the key is to base it on carbon content. So in the bill that I had, which admittedly was a sophomoric attempt. I mean, if you look back at the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act 2009, it would not have ever passed in that form. It would have needed a lot more work. But I wasn't on Ways and Means, and I wasn't on Energy and Commerce. I had great staff. We did as best as we could, but it needs some additional work. But the idea that we had was to base the tax on American equivalent products, there being no way to audit energy inputs in China, let's say. So rather just base it on American equivalents. So we know in the production of a sheet of flat steel in America, generally how much CO2 is emitted in the production of that steel, right? Because we got good numbers on that. We got good data on that. And this is for Jim another day, is ladies and gentlemen of the WTO, we're clearly not trying to be trade punitive here because there's a break right there to China. We're basing it on American equivalents, not on their actuals. They're more energy intensive than we are. They got to burn more stuff in order to make their stuff. So we burn less stuff in order to make our stuff. And so we're giving them a break right there in using American equivalents, but it's also an administrative simplicity that we don't have to go audit them. And so here's the way I think that would work out is a sheet of flat steel is coming through the port of, say, Charleston, South Carolina today from China. They stole the technology, and here it comes, a sheet of flat steel from China. It's cheap compared to ours, let's say. We impose a tax based on American equivalents. They say, you can't do that. That's an impermissible tariff. We take it, we defend the case in WTO. We think we win it based on precedents in the chemical industry that say you can have a content tax. If it's upheld, China 24 hours later, because they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus in China. They are not a very fair or nice government, but they are extremely efficient. They would have the same price on carbon dioxide. Why? Because they just paid in Charleston a tax. It's being remitted to Washington. If they'd collected that internal to China, the tax money would have been in Beijing, and the sheet of flat steel would come through the port of Charleston with no border adjustment based on carbon content. So 24 hours later, they got the same price on carbon dioxide. Now, you still have the enforcement question about whether they are actually imposing the tax internal China, and that's a constant question, I guess, Jim, and everything that the WTO has to deal with is, are they actually doing it? But the point is that they then follow our lead, and then you've got China and India. You got the whole world following because you're doing business anywhere in the world. You're doing business with China and India, and with China and the United States. But here's the thing too. This assumes that they have a felt need to do something, and I think that's a fairly safe assumption. In other words, I did just took a hit on the Chinese government, which I think is a terribly repressive communist regime that does terrible things to its people. Um, it's also true, though, that they're human beings, and if you're a repressive Chinese dictator, you might have a spouse and a child, and your child can't go out and play soccer. And they're feeling the effects of climate change in their throats and in their eyes. Okay, so you can't feel CO2, you won't feel it in your eyes or your throats, but you feel the proxies for it. The particulates are in your eyes and in your throat. And they have a felt need to do something. So your spouse is chewing on you saying, honey, do something so that our kid can go out and play soccer in the park. And so if that's the case, we got something to work with in China, with them figuring a way to maintain a comparative advantage in mass manufacturing, which is, I guess, what they will insist on doing. And, once I was at UT Austin and there was a Chinese national who's getting his PhD in economics, I said, have I got a PhD dissertation topic for you? I said, the comparative advantage, the impact of a carbon tax on China's comparative advantage in mass manufacturing, and whether it be trimmed too much by pricing carbon dioxide to make it unattractive to the government, or whether China could maintain its edge in mass manufacturing, even with a carbon price. And I don't know if he ever did that dissertation or not, but that's, in other words, I'm operating on the assumption that there's a felt need internal to China to deal with this, and that we're not the only ones in the world who think that we need to act on climate change.
Thanks, Bob. We have a number of other questions, all good. They're moving so fast, I was about to read one and it disappeared. But essentially the question was, could you expand on the idea of communicating to conservatives in their own language to advocate for climate change mitigation measures? Also, do you have any suggestions of how to open climate change skeptics within the Republican Party to accept climate science? This same question was raised by a number of people online in a variety of phrasing.
Yeah. So the language difference I'm talking about is this. I'm borrowing heavily here from Dan Kahan at Yale. Dan has a joint appointment in law and psychology. And he's brilliant, has data. I have hunches. It just happens to, my hunches seem to be confirmed by his data. And so Dan says that generally speaking, there are two personality types and they're quite different. Progressives, he says, are communitarian egalitarians. They believe in community and they focus on fairness. Conservatives, he says, are hierarchical individualists. They believe in hierarchies, working through a chain of command, and they believe in individual effort and reward, risk and reward. And so their languages differ. And Jonathan Haidt probably has some same kind of concepts to add here. But to give you an example of a very practical outworking of that, I worked with Robbie Kinner, the filmmaker of the film Merchants of Doubt. He also did Food Inc., if you've seen that, and a number of other fabulous films. He's really a neat, wonderful filmmaker. So Robbie sent me a draft of the ending of Merchants of Doubt before it was released. And it had footage of Jim Hansen chaining himself to the White House fence. And then it had me right after that saying something. And I said, Robbie, could you sort of cut out that part about Jim Hansen chaining himself to the White House fence? As it turns out, he didn't honor my request. He went ahead with having Jim Hansen change himself to the White House fence. But can you see that's not what conservatives do? If conservatives want to present a concern about Agenda 21, that's how the UN is taking over the world. I don't know if you know it's happening, but you heard it here first. That was a joke, by the way. That was a joke. But if Jim, I think they're probably talking about Agenda 21 when you're in Congress, right? I mean, it's like, so what a conservative does is go to county council and rail about that. Now, what in the world county council is going to have to do with that, I don't know. But conservatives work through a chain of command. They don't go chain themselves in direct action they don't chain themselves to the White House fence. And so that's an outworking of the difference between these two languages and approaches. And so what we think we got to do is go to them with credible messengers who speak the language of conservatism, hierarchical individual language, and join particularly voices out of the business community who use that language naturally, and join people in the faith community who use that language. Not so many yet evident in the climate space, because most people in the faith frame in the climate space are actually theological liberals who are also political liberals. But there is developing on the right, if you will. It's sort of strange to speak in theological left and right, but there's a conservative theological group that is beginning to develop, and it's a very different language. You won't hear Mother Earth on the right. You hear that on the left. You don't hear it on the right. You don't want to mention Mother Earth in a Republican precinct meeting. Particularly if it's in the Bible Belt here in South Carolina. You would not want to mention that. You can talk about Creator God, but you don't want to be talking about Mother Earth. And so those are language differences, and they matter, because what we have devolved into, okay, now I'm way out of my area of expertise, but what the heck, may as well try it out, right? The internet was supposed to be this great source of information. Well, what it had turned out to be was a fire hose. We got too much information. And so now we turn to people who share our identity, who we think have distilled it for us. And now we can get a drink out of that fountain. And so we tune into Sean Hannity to find out what we should be thinking. And that's what we've got to get to, that source, and sort of speak some of the same language, but help them turn around to say, wait a minute, it's quite conservative to care about climate change. In fact, it'd be absolutely crazy, wild-eyed liberal to proceed in the face of risk without any mitigating of that risk. Are you nuts? That'd be crazy. So if you present it in that way as conservatism, then people can say, oh yeah, that's right. Oh, and here's some hope, by the way. I keep on mentioning that MAGA half-life. It is interesting that 20 to 30% of Trump supporters actually care about climate change. So there is some, in other words, I acknowledge our challenge at republican.org of that MAGA half-life. But within it, there are 20 to 30% of them who actually care about climate change. So it's a matter of creating an identity that they can feel comfortable with, and they can say, yes, okay, those are our people. And so we go to them with that language, use these shibboleths of the right. And just to, it's sort of a strange biblical term, shibboleth, right? In other words, these sayings that prove who you are and whether you are actually part of the tribe. So, for example, when Mitt Romney was running for president, and he was somewhere in Mississippi or somewhere in the Deep South, and he said something about cheesy grits. Well, everybody here, I hope, knows there is no such thing as cheesy grits. There are cheese grits, not cheesy grits. We don't have cheesy grits in South Carolina. We have cheese grits, Mitt. And so his failure to use the right term tipped everybody off. Oh, you're from Utah, you're from Boston, you don't know anything about Mississippi or South Carolina, right? And so you got to use the right, and we just happen to be able to use them because it's our natural language. We know cheese grits.
You remind me of Donald Trump talking about 1 Corinthians.
Yes, exactly.
Very similar. This next question, I think, is a very good one. Probably in part because whatever our differing partisan affiliations are, you and I come from a similar standpoint otherwise, and look at the world in a similar way overall. And the question is, you mentioned your spiritual awakening to the peril of climate change. That type of experience, and here I'm reading, is fairly common among people who are, quote, converted from climate skeptics to climate proponents. Is your organization working to create spiritual language and opportunities for skeptics?
Early on, we had a decision to make. It's just, do we sit under the sign of a fish? In other words, as a Christian, this Christian sign of a fish. I decided I didn't want to do that. You know why? I didn't want to write the faith statement to figure out who's in, who's out, who belongs, who doesn't. I didn't want to do that. Can do that at church. Didn't want to do that in this organization. Or to sit under the sign of national security. Well, my only career regret is not serving in the U.S. military. Other people can do that much more credibly than I can. And thank goodness there are people out there that do that. So we didn't want to sit under that sign. We chose to sit under a sign that looks like that because it's basically identifies as people of the right, in other words, conservatives on policy and economics. But when the question comes from the faith frame, I love it, because then that gives me an opportunity to express my personal views. And it usually is impactful. Yes, and answer the question is it means that people in the audience are really surprised to hear something they're not used to hearing. It's sad, it's tragic, actually, that they're not used to hearing somebody who clearly is expressing faith and the role of faith in his life, caring about climate change, particularly when they get the feeling that you're coming from the right, not from the left. Again, most people in the in the faith frame who are operating on climate change or operating on climate change in the faith frame tend to be theological and political liberals. In other words, theological liberals, what I mean, people with a relatively relaxed view of what Scripture says, compared to churches that I'm more familiar with, which have a very decided view about exactly what Scripture says, and want to stick to exactly what it says. That's a divide there. And if you take one of those theological liberals into that congregation, you won't find much action. So to give you an example, I was once, we work with our friends at Evangelical Environmental Network, and we were invited to go to San Antonio, Texas, to speak to a church. And I'm thinking, oh, a Baptist church in Texas. I'm all excited. It got to be the biggest Baptist church in the world because it is in Texas. Everything in Texas is big, and so I'm thinking this is going to be terrific. And I get there and I realize CBF is on all the posters in the lobby, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Well, that's the more mainline Baptist church. I thought I was going to be in a Southern Baptist church, in which case I was going to feel the oar in the water and I was going to give it a pull. As it was, I was in a Cooperative Baptist Fellowship church, which they probably already agreed with me. In this case, there's a whiff on the oars, it's like, okay, let's go on to the next place. Let's get on talk radio here quickly, because I need to get somewhere where I got the oar in the water. Because otherwise I don't want to just talk to people who already agree with me. I got to talk with I got to go take the arrows, on talk radio and find out what their problem is so that I can help them realize the power of their own ideas as conservatives to believe in free enterprise. So that's, we answer in the faith frame and enjoy it very much. But we don't organize in the faith frame. In other words, our branding and everything is not about here Christians rise to solve climate change.
Thank you, Bob. What we've been hearing you say is, of course, that we need market-backed market-based solutions to climate change. This is something with which I agree entirely. And for those who don't realize it, a carbon tax is a market-based solution as opposed to regulation. So in talking about providing incentives and disincentives via taxation, we're talking about altering the marketplace by sending a price signal in the marketplace. Here is the question. It comes from Chris Castro, one of our leaders in climate action in Central Florida, and indeed beyond Central Florida. And basically the question Chris asked is, economically, are there some specific sectors on which we should be focusing our efforts here and now?
Yeah, I think that that it's a good question, because you can have a sectorial approach, or you can try to have an economy-wide approach. What I think what we're advocating is economy-wide, but it does have a specific sector that is hit immediately, and that's the power sector. So if you price carbon dioxide, coal is graveyard dead. It's already dying. It's on life support. But if you put a price on carbon dioxide, it's graveyard dead. And so you accomplish the conversion of the power sector very quickly through a carbon tax. The transportation sector, it might be a little bit harder, because the carbon tax may not be a strong enough price signal to effectuate change. You might therefore continue to do some things with higher CAFE standards, fuel economy standards, things like that. But if you start with this, the beauty of starting with a market-based approach of a carbon tax is the border adjustment. I think that the border adjustment is or we think at republican.org, that the border adjustment is the very important part of this that gives you a chance of getting the world in on this thing. And so rather than say, okay, listen, we're going to go sector by sector, we're going to start with the power sector. That was a clean power plan. And then we'll go to the transportation sector with higher CAFE standards. Is rather start with the carbon pricing and then see if it's where it's failing. And where it's failing, you may have to step in and do other stuff. Because the reality is that carbon pricing is not the salvation of the world and the solution to every problem we face. It will not scratch your back. It will not put a piece of apple pie on your plate. It won't solve all of our problems. But it is what most economists say is the first and most obvious thing to do about climate change. And then you got to do some other stuff too. So the reason we mostly start, though, with that economy-wide is you get the chance at worldwide through the border adjustment. And that's counting also in some goodwill, Jim, I think, on the part of other countries who have a felt need too, just like I was describing in China. They want to find a way to make it work. And if I could just admit too, that this border adjustment would be the world's most complicated thing to set up. But it may also be the shortest lived regime ever, because if the rest of the world follows, you don't have much implementation, because they're implementing it in their own country. In other words, the adjustment never comes into effect. And if you can do that through diplomacy in advance, all the better. And this is why Jim's continuing work all around the world is important, because if you can, through that diplomacy, get people to the place where they're saying, listen, let's have an agreement ahead of time so we don't have to set up that complicated border adjustment regime or collection mechanism. Maybe we can just go ahead and skip that step, and that would be really valuable, because I've got to admit that the border adjustment otherwise is complex.
For those who are interested in the complexities of such a border adjustment, I won't bore you with them now, but I did hold forth at length on that issue just yesterday in a webinar presented by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Earlier in the year, I did so for the Chatham Institute. Both of those are available online. And I'll be speaking at a global symposium at Tufts University tomorrow about China's role in the world, and will address the issue as well. Bob, are there any last thoughts you have before we finish up here in about 2 or 3 minutes?
Well, just a big thank you to all of you for being part of this, and for Jim, your leadership and continuing work. You know, about the only thing you can hope for in a career is to be about something big enough to be about. And surely being in this together to solve climate action, it's big enough to be about. And so it's really pretty exciting to be with a group of people who care about these topics and are willing to find a way forward. And so if you you know what I always say, if cousin Charlie or Uncle Charlie's coming to Easter or Passover with you, and you're a conservative, talk to him, love him into action. If you're a progressive and you're really going to have trouble with Charlie, send him to our website. We'll talk to Charlie. You know, so it's a matter of getting people to hear it in their own language. And once we do that, I think we can bring America together and lead the world to a solution. So that's what we're about. Thank you for being about it. And thank you, Jim, for, yes, your continuing work on this. It's crucial to figure a way to get the world in. And that's the kind of thing that you're focused on. So thank you.
Thank you, my friend. And thank you all for tuning in to this little show of ours. We'll be having another one in a few weeks, and we're going to be working closely with Bob going forward. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks. See ya.